The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and drew a fine, gritty shroud over everything Elias Thorne owned. It painted the world in shades of beige and sorrow, a constant, biting reminder of the land's indifference. The sun, a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky, beat down on the warped shingles of his ranch house, on the weathered gray of the barn, and on the man himself as he split wood with the rhythmic, joyless efficiency of a machine. Each swing of the axe was a punctuation mark in the vast, oppressive silence that was his life. The silence was his oldest companion, a presence so profound it had its own weight, its own texture. He had carved this existence from the unyielding rock and unforgiving soil, a solitary kingdom of sweat and memory, and he had come to believe he wanted nothing more. Elias was a man built of the same hard materials as his land. His shoulders were wide, his hands calloused into plates of leather, and his face was a road map of every hardship he had ever endured. Lines etched by sun and squinting radiated from the corners of his pale blue eyes that held the flat, distant look of a man who spent more time watching the horizon than the faces of other people. He had come here to forget a world of noise and violence, a world that had taken everything from him except the strength in his back and the bitter code he lived by. A debt was a debt, a promise was a promise, and solitude was peace. These were the simple, unbending pillars of his world. The distant groan of the weekly stagecoach was an unwelcome intrusion, a tear in the fabric of his carefully constructed quiet. He paused, axe buried in a half-split log, and listened. The sound grew, a lumbering complaint of wood and iron that meant mail, or supplies, or trouble. For him, it usually meant trouble. Jedediah Mills owed him a significant sum, a debt incurred over a game of cards that had gone too long and a bottle of whiskey that had been too cheap. Mills, a man whose promises were as flimsy as smoke, had sworn to settle it. He had sent a letter ahead, promising a solution that would be worth more than the cash. Elias had expected a strong-backed youth, perhaps one of Mills's innumerable unfortunate nephews, sent to work off the family's shame with hard labor. He could always use another hand, even a reluctant one. He watched as the coach crested the final rise, a black beetle crawling through the shimmering heat haze. It pulled up in a cloud of the ever-present dust, the horses sighing and stamping, their hides lathered with sweat. The driver, a weary man named Gus, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Thorne," he grunted, a full conversation in a single word. Elias gave a curt nod in reply. The passenger door creaked open, and a small booted foot descended, followed by a figure so profoundly out of place that for a moment Elias thought the heat had finally cooked his senses. She was a woman, slight of build, dressed in a simple but well-made traveling dress the color of a bruised plum. Her hair was the color of polished jet, pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the delicate, unyielding lines of her face. She was Chinese, her features a stark, beautiful contrast to the harsh, sun-blasted landscape around her. She moved with a stillness, an unnerving composure, as she stepped down onto the hard-packed earth. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, swept over the scene. The barren yard, the dilapidated porch, the man with the axe, and betrayed nothing. Gus tossed a small trunk onto the ground and handed Elias a sealed envelope. "She's yours," Gus said, his tone a mixture of pity and disinterest. Jedediah settled his account. Elias did not take his eyes off the woman. This was not a hired hand. This was not a solution. This was a complication he could neither comprehend nor abide. He tore open the envelope, his thumb splitting the cheap paper. The note was short, the handwriting a drunken scrawl. It spoke of debts and honor, words that meant nothing coming from a man like Mills. Tucked inside was a second document, a bill of sale, written in a more precise legalistic script. It named one Mei Ling, described her as an indentured ward, and transferred her service to Elias Thorne in perpetuity for the complete and final settlement of all outstanding financial obligations. A cold, sharp anger, an emotion he had not felt in years, pierced through his stoic reserve. He had seen men trade horses, cattle, and land. He had never seen a man trade a person. The casual cruelty of it, the sheer damnable arrogance of Jedediah Mills assuming he would accept a human being as chattel, sickened him. He looked from the vile paper in his hand to the woman. She stood perfectly still by her trunk, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on some point just beyond his shoulder. She looked like a porcelain doll left in a scrapyard, fragile and utterly alone. "There's been a mistake," Elias said, his voice a low rasp, unused to forming so many words at once. Gus was already climbing back onto his seat. "Ain't my mistake. I just drive the coach." He cracked the whip, and the horses strained, the heavy vehicle groaning as it began to turn. "Next one's through in a month," he called over his shoulder, as if reading Elias's mind. The coach lumbered away, its dust trail a fading signature on the horizon. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. It was just him and the woman. He was a man who had built walls around his life, and a stranger had just been thrown over them, landing square in the middle of his solitude. He looked at the paper again, at the spidery signature of Jedediah Mills. Then he looked at her. Her face remained a mask of calm dignity, but he saw the faint tremor in her hands, clenched at her sides. She was not calm. She was terrified, and he, Elias Thorne, was now her jailer. The thought tasted like ash in his mouth. He wanted to shout, to curse Mills's name to the heavens, to send her away. But the dust was already settling and the horizon was empty. There was nowhere for her to go. The sky to the west was beginning to bruise, the first sign of the storm the old-timers had been predicting for weeks. A cool wind, the storm's herald, whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of rain and distant ozone. There was no sending her back, not with the stage gone and that weather rolling in. He was trapped, and so was she. He crushed the bill of sale in his fist, the paper crackling in protest. His world of simple, unbending pillars had just begun to crumble. He finally met her eyes. "There's a room inside," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. "You can stay until the next coach." He did not offer to take her trunk. He simply turned and walked toward the house, the weight of her presence following him like a second shadow. The first days were a contest of silences. Elias moved through his chores with a grim, deliberate rhythm, his anger a low-burning coal in his gut. He was furious with Mills for his depravity and furious with himself for his unwilling complicity. The woman, who had offered her name as Lynn, moved through the small house with a quietness that was almost supernatural. She took the small spare room, little more than a closet with a cot, and made it her own without leaving a trace. She was a ghost in his home, a fleeting presence he would catch in the corner of his eye, only for her to vanish when he turned to look. He did not know what to do with her. The very idea of ordering her around, of treating her as the piece of property Mills had intended, was abhorrent to him. So he ignored her. He rose before the sun, ate a cold breakfast of bread and jerky, and worked until the last light failed, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion so that sleep would come without thought. He left food on the table, and when he returned, it was gone, his own plate washed and set aside. The house began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A persistent layer of dust vanished from the windowsills. The chaotic mess of pots and pans in the kitchen was organized. The air inside, which had always smelled of stale wood smoke and solitude, now carried the faint, clean scent of soap and sometimes, inexplicably, of herbs he could not name. On the third day, the predicted storm broke with a theatrical fury. The sky turned the color of a fresh wound, and rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The world beyond his windows dissolved into a gray blur. He was trapped inside, the small cabin suddenly shrinking around the two of them. The silence, once a comfort, was now charged with an unbearable tension. He sat at his rough-hewn table, cleaning a rifle he had already cleaned twice that week, the scent of gun oil sharp in the air. Lynn sat in the corner, mending one of his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He needed to break the quiet, if only to prove it could be broken. He cleared his throat. "That fence by the north pasture," he began, the words rough. "The wire is tangled, a mess." He did not know why he said it. It was a test, a foolish, frustrated jab at her composure. It was a man's work, heavy and complicated. He was gesturing at the absurdity of her presence, of Mills's insult. She did not look up from her sewing. "I saw it," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying no accent he could place. It was simply precise. The storm raged for 2 days, and on the morning the sky finally cleared, the world was washed clean, the air sharp and cool. The ground was a sodden mess of mud. He expected her to remain inside. Instead, as he pulled on his boots, he saw that she was already on the porch, wearing a pair of his old work gloves that were far too big for her and sturdy boots he hadn't realized she owned. She had bundled her dark dress up around her knees. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The fence," she said. It was not a question. He grunted, a sound of grudging assent, and led the way, the thick mud sucking at his boots. He expected to spend the day untangling the mess himself while she stood by, useless. The storm had knocked a tree down, crushing a long section of the fence, weaving the barbed wire into a metal bird's nest of vicious tangles. It was a hateful, bloody job. He picked up a pair of pliers and set to work, pulling and twisting, the barbs tearing at his leather gloves. After a moment, she approached the twisted wreck from the other side. He watched, ready to tell her to stand back. She did not touch the wire. Instead, she studied it for a full minute, her head tilted, her dark eyes tracing the intricate knots. She was like a scholar examining a complex text. Then she picked up a fallen branch and used it as a lever, prying one section up. She pointed. "If you cut here," she said, her voice calm and analytical, "this entire length will come free. The tension is holding it." Elias stared at the point she indicated. She was right. He had been fighting the tension, trying to wrestle it into submission. She had seen the logic in the chaos, the key to its undoing. He snipped the wire where she had pointed. With a great metallic sigh, a massive section of the tangle sprang loose, falling away into a manageable coil. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. There was a smudge of mud on her cheek, and her brow was furrowed in concentration. She was not a doll. She was an engineer. They worked for the rest of the day, a strange, unspoken partnership forming between them. He provided the brute strength, cutting and pulling where she directed. She saw the patterns, the points of leverage, the most efficient way to disassemble the chaos. She never complained about the mud that stained her dress or the thorns that snagged the fabric. She simply worked, her small hands moving with a deft, certain grace. By late afternoon, the entire section was cleared, the broken posts removed, and the new wire ready to be strung. It was a job that would have taken him 2 days of cursing and bleeding. They had done it in one. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the damp earth, they stood before the repaired fence line, taut and perfect. He looked at the work, then back at her. The respect he felt was a foreign, surprising thing. It was clean and sharp, like the air after the storm. He had judged her on her size, her gender, her race. He had seen a delicate ornament. He had been a fool. "You have done this before," he stated, the words an admission of his own ignorance. She pulled off the oversized gloves, revealing hands that were slender but not soft. The palms were calloused, the skin toughened by work he could not imagine. "My father taught me that every problem, even a knot of wire, has a structure," she said, her gaze distant for a moment. "You only need to find the right place to apply pressure." They walked back to the house in a new kind of silence. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was a shared quiet, the quiet of two people who had accomplished something together. That evening, for the first time, they ate at the same table. The food was a simple stew, but she had added wild herbs she had gathered, and it filled the small room with a rich, savory aroma. He ate, and he watched her, this woman who was supposed to be a debt, a piece of property. He was beginning to understand that Jedediah Mills, in his drunken foolishness, had sent him something far more valuable and far more dangerous than a mere hired hand. He was beginning to understand that the fragile truce between them was solidifying into something else entirely. And, for the first time in a long time, he did not feel entirely alone. The peace that settled over the ranch was as fragile as a desert flower. It was a quiet born of routine and mutual observation, not of trust. Elias found himself watching Lynn, studying the economy of her movements, the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She organized his supply shed, creating a system of inventory so logical it shamed his years of chaotic stacking. She mended his clothes, baked bread that filled the house with a warmth he had forgotten, and spoke only when necessary. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, yet her presence was slowly and irrevocably reshaping his world. He began to see the strength she held, a resilience that was not brittle but flexible, like forged steel. The debt note, the ugly bill of sale, lay tucked away in a drawer, a source of a dull, constant shame he refused to confront. Their fragile world was shattered on a Tuesday. The air was still and heavy, the kind of day where sound carried for miles. Elias was reshoeing a horse in the barn when he heard the riders. It was not the sound of a lone traveler or a neighbor. It was the arrogant, rhythmic beat of multiple horses moving with purpose. He set the hoof down gently and moved to the barn door, his hand resting instinctively on the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. 3 men rode into his yard as if they owned it. The man in the lead was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a blight on the landscape, a man who believed the world was his for the taking. He had bought or bullied his way into owning most of the valley, all except for Elias's small, stubborn plot. The reason was simple. The creek that ran through Elias's land was the only reliable water source for miles, and Blackwood coveted it with a greedy, obsessive hunger. He was a large man, soft in the way of men who paid others to do their sweating, with a face that was a mask of smug condescension. "Thorn," Blackwood boomed, his voice falsely jovial. He dismounted, his expensive boots sinking into the dirt of Elias's yard. His 2 hired guns remained in their saddles, their eyes cold and watchful, their hands hovering near their holsters. "Still living in this pigsty, I see. I thought a man of your reputation would have better taste." Elias did not rise to the bait. He remained in the shadows of the barn, his expression unreadable. "Blackwood, state your business and get off my land." Blackwood chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Always so direct. My business is the same as it's always been. Your land, your water. I'm making you a final offer. A generous one. More than this pile of sticks is worth." He gestured dismissively at the house. It was then that the cabin door opened. Lynn stepped out onto the porch, a basket of laundry in her arms. She froze when she saw the men, her composure a shield. But Elias saw the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the way her grip on the basket whitened her knuckles. Blackwood's eyes slid over to her, his gaze lingering with a slimy, appraising quality. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. Well, what have we here? I didn't realize you had taken on company, Thorn, and an exotic one at that. Have you finally decided to spend some of that money I've been offering you on creature comforts?" One of the hired guns snickered. "Looks like he bought himself a little china doll." The insult, crude and dismissive, hung in the air. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. It was one thing for these men to threaten him, to covet his land. It was another to stand in his yard and degrade her. He took a step out of the barn, moving into the harsh sunlight. His shadow fell long and menacing on the ground. "She is under my protection," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. The words were out before he had even thought them. It was a declaration, a line drawn not in the dust, but in bedrock. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, amused. "Protection? Is that what you call it? Don't be a fool, Thorn. Everyone knows what a woman like that is for." He turned his attention back to Elias, his tone hardening. "This is my last offer. $500 for the deed. You take it, and you and your property can be on your way. You refuse, and I will be forced to take other measures. That creek will be mine, one way or another." The threat was naked, stripped of all pretense. It was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Elias's hand was no longer resting on his pistol. It was gripping it. The air grew thick, charged with the promise of violence. He could see the tension in the shoulders of Blackwood's men, the readiness in their eyes. 3-1. Bad odds, but not impossible. Lynn, who had remained silent on the porch, spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone level and coolly formal, "this property is not for sale. You are trespassing. I suggest you leave." Blackwood and his men turned to stare at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and contemptuous amusement, that a woman, and a Chinese woman at that, would dare to address them. Blackwood let out a bark of laughter. "Did the doll speak? Thorn, you'd best teach your pet some manners." Before Elias could react, Lynn took a deliberate step forward on the porch. "The law in this territory is quite clear regarding trespassing and uttering threats," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Sheriff Brody may be a patient man, but even he has his limits." The mention of the law, of the sheriff, seemed to momentarily deflate Blackwood's bravado. It was a reminder that while he might rule through fear, there were still rules he had to at least pretend to follow. He shot a venomous glare, first at Lynn, then at Elias. "This isn't over, Thorn," he spat. "You'll regret this. You'll be begging to sell when your cattle are bone dry and your tongue is stuck to the roof of your mouth." He hauled himself back onto his horse, his face flushed with anger. "Let's go," he snarled at his men. They wheeled their horses around and galloped out of the yard, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of their threats behind. The silence they left was worse than the noise. Elias stood frozen for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving a cold dread in its place. Blackwood was not a man of idle threats. He had declared war. He turned to look at Lynn. She was still standing on the porch, the laundry basket held in front of her like a shield. Her face was pale, but her chin was held high. She had not flinched. She had not backed down. She had faced down the most powerful man in the valley with nothing but words and courage. In that moment, the last of his perceptions of her as a victim, as a fragile piece of porcelain, shattered completely. She was not under his protection. It was beginning to feel as though they were protecting each other. The attack, when it came, was not one of hot blood and gunpowder, but of cold, calculated malice. 2 days after Blackwood's visit, the creek began to shrink. Elias noticed it first as a subtle change in the sound of the water, a weakening of its steady, life-giving song. By midday, the flow was a fraction of what it should have been, the water level dropping to reveal slick, dark stones that had not seen the sun in years. By evening, the once gurgling creek was a pathetic, muddy trickle. Blackwood had made good on his threat. He had dammed the creek upstream, cutting off the ranch's very lifeblood. A grim understanding settled over Elias. This was a siege. Blackwood would not need to fire a single shot. He would simply wait for the thirst to do his work for him. The cattle were already lowing with distress, gathering at the drying water trough. The small vegetable garden Lynn had started near the house would be withered by morning. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar serpent, coiled in Elias's stomach. He could fight men, but he did not know how to fight a drought engineered by pure greed. He spent the rest of the day in a flurry of grim activity, checking the water levels in the rain barrels, calculating how long their stored supply would last. Days. A week, perhaps, if they were careful. He paced the length of the small cabin, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, his mind a maelstrom of desperate, violent plans. He could ride upstream, dynamite the dam, but Blackwood would be waiting for that. It would be a trap, an ambush he would be unlikely to survive. Lynn watched him, her expression calm and observant. She did not offer platitudes or panic. She simply watched as he wore a track in his own floor, his frustration mounting with every step. Finally, as the last of the evening light bled from the sky, she spoke. "Pacing will not fill the barrels," she said quietly. He stopped, turning to face her. "And what do you suggest?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "That we pray for rain?" She did not react to his anger. Instead, she unrolled a piece of paper on the table. It was a rough map of his property and the surrounding lands, which she must have drawn from memory. It was surprisingly accurate. "You are thinking like a soldier, about a frontal assault," she said, her finger tracing the blue line of the creek. "You need to think like a strategist. Blackwood expects you to attack the dam here, where the creek is narrowest and the road is close. It is the obvious move." Elias stared at the map. She was right. That was exactly what he had been planning. "But," she continued, her finger moving away from the creek, tracing a series of low-lying hills and dry gullies to the west, "what he has forgotten, or perhaps never knew, is the lay of the land itself. Your deed, which I read in the county records office when I was waiting for the stage, describes a secondary spring, an old one somewhere in these hills. It is marked as intermittent." He looked at her, stunned. He had been to the records office once, years ago, and found it a bewildering maze of dusty ledgers. The thought that she had not only navigated it, but had memorized the details of his own deed was staggering. He knew of the old spring. His father had spoken of it, but it had been dry for as long as he could remember, a useless indentation in the earth. "It's been dry for 30 years, he said, dismissing the idea. "The storm," she said simply. "The ground is saturated. An intermittent spring is not a dead spring. It is a spring that has lost its path. The water is still there, underground, searching for a way out. We do not need to destroy Blackwood's dam. We only need to bypass it." Her gaze met his, and for the first time he saw not just intelligence but a flicker of fierce, unyielding determination. "We need to dig." The transactional arrangement was forgotten. The awkwardness of their cohabitation vanished. They were now partners, united against a common foe. The next morning they set out before dawn, armed with shovels, picks, and the map she had drawn. She led him into the rocky hills he had rarely explored, navigating with an unerring sense of direction. She moved with a purpose that belied her small frame, her eyes scanning the ground, reading the subtle dips and folds in the earth. She finally stopped in a small, shallow basin choked with weeds and rocks. It looked like nothing. "Here," she said with certainty. He trusted her. He did not know why, but he did. He drove his shovel into the earth. For hours they worked under the relentless sun, their shared goal a silent bond between them. He did the heavy work, breaking the rocky soil with the pickaxe, his muscles straining. She worked beside him, clearing the loosened dirt, her movements efficient and tireless. Sweat soaked their clothes, and dust caked their faces. They did not speak, save for brief exchanges about angles and depth. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels against rock and their own ragged breaths. The sun was high in the sky when his shovel hit something different. Not rock, but thick, damp clay. A dark patch of moisture spread from the impact. A sense of hope, so potent it was almost painful, surged through him. "Here," he grunted, and they attacked the spot with renewed vigor. An hour later, they broke through. It began as a slow seep, then a trickle, then a steady, miraculous flow of clean, cold water bubbling up from the earth. It was not a gushing river, but it was life. It was enough. The spring, dormant for a generation, had been reborn. Elias sank to his knees, plunging his hands into the muddy pool, the cold water a balm on his raw skin. He looked up at Lynn. She was standing over the spring, her face streaked with dirt, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. In that moment, surrounded by the harsh, unforgiving landscape, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She had not just found water. She had given him back his hope. He realized with a certainty that shook him to his core that he was no longer just fighting for his land. He was fighting for her. He was fighting for the home they were accidentally, miraculously building together in the dust. The siege was not over, but the nature of the war had changed. The discovery of the spring bought them time, but both Elias and Lynn knew it was not a permanent solution. It was a reprieve. Blackwood was a man who did not tolerate being outmaneuvered. His fury would be stoked, not quenched, by their resourcefulness. They worked tirelessly, digging a narrow channel to divert the spring's flow toward the main creek bed below the dam, a desperate, back-breaking effort to restore life to the ranch. During this shared labor, a new rhythm developed between them. The silence was now comfortable, punctuated by the easy shorthand of people who understand each other without words. He learned the determined set of her jaw meant she had an idea, and she learned the slight narrowing of his eyes meant danger was near. The danger came 3 nights later. A full moon hung in the inky sky, bathing the landscape in an eerie, silver light. Elias was on the porch, a rifle across his lap, unable to sleep. A sixth sense, honed by a past he never spoke of, prickled at the back of his neck. The night was too quiet. The insects were silent. The coyotes were not calling. It was the silence of held breath. He saw a flicker of movement by the distant fence line, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Then another. He moved back inside without a sound, his feet sure on the familiar floorboards. Lynn was already awake, standing by the table, a small, deadly-looking pistol held in her hand with a familiarity that sent a jolt of shock through him. It was a gun he had never seen before, a compact weapon of blued steel. She had not been mending his shirt that day of the storm. She had been cleaning her own weapon. "How many?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. 4, maybe 5, he replied, his mind racing. He sent his dogs. "They will try to burn the barn first," she said, her voice devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, tactical assessment. "To draw you out." He looked at her, at the gun held steady in her grip, and 1,000 questions surfaced, only to be submerged by the immediate threat. There was no time for revelations now. There was only survival. "The windows," he commanded, and they moved to opposite sides of the small cabin, becoming a synchronized unit of defense. The first torch arced through the night, a fiery comet that landed on the dry roof of the barn. The shingles caught instantly, flames licking up toward the sky like hungry orange tongues. As Lynn had predicted, it was a lure. The shadows began to move from the fence line toward the house, their figures stark against the growing blaze. A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the window frame inches from Elias's head. He returned fire, the boom of his rifle echoing across the valley. The fight began in earnest. Gunfire shattered the night, a deadly conversation between the house and the encroaching darkness. Elias was a brutally effective fighter, methodical and calm, each shot placed with lethal intent. But it was Lynn who was the revelation. She fired in short, controlled bursts, her small pistol barking with surprising force. She did not waste ammunition. Every shot was a response, a calculated act. When one of Blackwood's men tried to flank the house, using the corner of the porch for cover, she leaned out of her window just far enough, fired twice, and the man crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain. She was not just proficient. She was a master. The grace she applied to mending a fence or organizing a pantry, she now applied to the grim art of combat. The battle raged, the air growing thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning hay. The heat from the barn fire was becoming intense, the light casting dancing, demonic shadows. They were holding them off, but they were outnumbered. It was a war of attrition they could not win. One of the attackers made a desperate rush for the front door, a heavy axe in his hands, ready to smash it down. Elias leveled his rifle, but another man pinned him down with a volley of suppressing fire, forcing him to duck as bullets tore through the wall above him. He was not going to make the shot. "The door!" he yelled. From the other side of the room, Lynn's pistol cracked once. The man with the axe stopped dead, his forward momentum carrying him stumbling onto the porch, where he collapsed in a heap. The assault faltered. 2 men were down. and the ferocity of the defense from the small cabin was clearly not what they had expected. The remaining attackers hesitated, their nerve breaking. They exchanged a few more wild shots before melting back into the darkness from which they had come, dragging their wounded companion with them. Silence descended, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn. The immediate danger had passed. Elias leaned against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs, his rifle still hot in his hands. He looked across the room at Lynn. She was methodically reloading her pistol, her hands steady, her face a pale oval in the flickering firelight. "My father was an envoy for a merchant company," she said, as if answering the question he hadn't asked. "He believed a woman's mind should be as well armed as a man's pistol. He taught me languages, law, and strategy. My mother taught me how to use this." She snapped the cylinder of the pistol shut with a final, decisive click. She said one was useless without the other. The great unmasking was not a single event, but a series of quiet truths falling into place. She was not Jedediah's ward. She was the daughter of a brilliant man who had been his business partner. Mills, through treachery and forged documents, had stolen her inheritance after her parents died of fever, leaving her destitute and trapped. The bill of sale was his final, cruel act of possession, a way to dispose of the evidence of his crime. As she spoke, the sound of a lone, hard-ridden horse reached them. Sheriff Brody. Drawn by the fire and the gunfire, he rode into the yard, his face grim in the hellish light. He saw the body on the porch, the bullet-riddled house, and the inferno that had once been a barn. "Thorne!" he yelled. "What in God's name happened here?" Before Elias could answer, Lynn stepped out onto the porch, her pistol still in her hand. "Silas Blackwood happened, Sheriff." And then, with a calm, irrefutable logic, she laid it all out. She presented not just the story of the night's attack, but the legal case against Blackwood. She spoke of the dam, a clear violation of water rights statutes. She spoke of the fraudulent land titles Blackwood had used to acquire other properties, flaws she had discovered during her meticulous research in the county records. The bill of sale from Mills was not just immoral, she explained. It was a legally void document based on a fraudulent claim of guardianship, making it evidence of a far greater crime. Sheriff Brody, a man worn down by the ambiguities of frontier justice, listened, his expression shifting from weariness to a slow-burning anger. Elias provided the physical proof, the bullet holes, the dead man on his porch, the smoldering ruin of his livelihood. But it was Lynn's words, her sharp legal mind, that provided the weapon that could truly defeat a man like Blackwood. It was not a bullet, but the law. As she finished speaking, a stray ember from the barn roof, carried on the wind, landed on Elias's sleeve. He brushed at it, not realizing the fabric had caught fire until a sharp pain seared his forearm. He cursed, beating at the flame. Lynn was at his side in an instant, her composure breaking for the first time as she saw the angry red burn. She tore a strip from her dress and gently, expertly, began to tend to the wound. In that moment, with the barn collapsing into a fiery skeleton behind them and the lawman watching, all that mattered was her cool, gentle touch on his skin. He looked down at her, at the fierce concern in her eyes, and knew the fight was over. They had won. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled bill of sale Jedediah Mills had given him, and tore it into pieces. He let the scraps of paper flutter from his fingers, where they were caught by the updraft from the fire and incinerated into ash. She was free. They both were. A month passed. The scar on Elias's arm faded from an angry red to a pale white line. The skeleton of the burned barn was cleared away, leaving a dark, rectangular wound on the earth. But where there was destruction, there was also new life. The creek, freed by an order from a federal judge that even Blackwood could not ignore, once again sang its steady song. The cattle were healthy, and the small garden Lynn had planted was a defiant patch of green against the brown earth. The ranch was quieter, scarred, but it was at peace. It was their peace, bought with courage and gunpowder. Blackwood was gone, his empire crumbling under the weight of legal challenges initiated by Lynn's meticulous evidence. Other ranchers he had swindled, emboldened by his fall, had come forward. Jedediah Mills had vanished, a coward fleeing from the consequences of his own deceit. The community, which had once watched them with suspicion, now spoke of Elias Thorne and the quiet Chinese woman with a new, grudging respect. They were no longer just the stoic rancher and his mysterious companion. They were the people who had broken Blackwood. Their life fell into a new, comfortable pattern. They worked side by side, rebuilding what had been lost. They planned a new barn, not out of necessity, but out of a shared vision for the future. The conversation about it was practical, filled with talk of timber, foundations, and roofing. Yet beneath the mundane words lay a deeper truth. They were building a home, together. The house was no longer his, it was theirs. One cool morning, they stood on the porch, mugs of hot coffee warm in their hands, watching the sunrise. It painted the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gold, promising a day of gentle warmth. The air was clean and crisp, and the silence was no longer a weight but a comfort, a space they filled with their shared presence. Elias looked out at the land, at the green line of the creek and the vast expanse of the valley. For years, this place had been his sanctuary and his prison, a place to hide from the world and its ghosts. He had thought he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He had been wrong. Solitude was not peace. Peace was this. Peace was the quiet woman standing beside him, the scent of her coffee mingling with the morning air. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the morning stillness. He turned to her. She was watching the sunrise, a small, serene smile on her face. He saw not the woman who had arrived in a plum-colored dress, a terrified stranger sold to settle a debt. He saw his partner. He saw the strategist who had saved his ranch, the warrior who had fought by his side, the gentle soul who had tended his wounds and healed the broken quiet of his life. "The soil is good here," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. It was not a comment on agriculture. It was a statement of intent. It was an offering. Lynn turned her gaze from the horizon to his face. Her dark eyes held his, and in their depths he saw not just acceptance, but a reflection of his own unspoken hope. She understood the question he was truly asking. Can we build a life here? Can we put down roots in this hard, beautiful land? Yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. She held up her coffee mug in a small, symbolic toast to the rising sun. It is very good soil. Her hand brushed against his as she lowered the mug, a fleeting touch that sent a current of warmth through him, more potent than the coffee, more brilliant than the dawn. He did not take her hand, not yet. There was no need to rush. They had the rest of their lives. A home, they were both learning, was not just a plot of land or a house built of wood. A home was a promise, a shared future. And for the first time, looking out at the endless sky, Elias Thorne felt like he had finally come home.